So welcome everyone to our first afternoon session, Risks of Invasive Trees. This session has been organized by myself and also by Katharina Lapin. So again, my name is Anja Bindewald, and the FORs, one project partner of our Interreg Alpine Space project ALPTREES. So today the topic is risks of invasive trees, and we will cover different non-native tree species in this session, and we will also cover different aspects like the invasiveness of non-native tree species, the risk perception, the risk assessment, propagal pressure, spread and establishment potentials, and the mitigation of impacts, and the management recommendations, which go hand in hand with the risk assessment. So this is the program that we have today, and I think you all received this program. So just to announce quickly, there's one change. So the presentation of Uwe Stafinger, he changed with Marcin Diderski. So just to inform you about this change. And I will start with the first presentation. So I would like to present you today one of our project outputs for the ALPTREES project. So this is the framework for site-specific risk assessment for the responsible management and use of non-native trees in European forests. And this framework has been developed as a part of our project, and but we have also incorporated experts from other institutions, like, for example, Giuseppe Brundu from the University of Sardinia. So in our ALPTREES project, we have 4 major project outputs. We want to develop a transnational strategy on the management and responsible use of non-native tree species. We want to develop a non-native tree species risk assessment tool for risk-benefit trade-off analysis based on the collection of non-native tree species data sets in the Alpine Space. We want to provide risk maps for nature conservation based on prediction models of ecosystem dynamics under climate change scenarios. And to share all this knowledge, we would like to publish an open ALPTREES knowledge hub. And now I will focus on the risk assessment tool, which we developed with the purpose to develop a useful tool for stakeholders such as forest managers and conservationists. So I would like to start with a short definition. What is a risk assessment? It can be defined as a standard method approach designed for evaluating the potential negative impacts associated with the introduction, establishment, and spread of a non-native species. And this risk assessment is being regarded as an important information base for the risk management, so to mitigate any negative effects. So why do we have to develop a new framework? It is because we identified several problems of already existing risk assessment methods. First of all, the data is often poor. So for example, information about the site-specific establishment potential and this ecosystem types most sensitive to invasion of non-native tree species is poor for several regions throughout Europe. And as a consequence, the data, because the data is poor, invasiveness is often assumed, and therefore the risk evaluation can be subjective. In addition, diverse methods have been developed worldwide, also in Europe. It's quite diverse how many methods are being applied in the different regions and countries. And they are based on different criteria, and criteria are weighted differently. And so the risk classifications of the non-native tree species are not comparable across jurisdictions. Most of the tools, they do not consider that the species can have both positive and negative impacts. Often locally observed negative impacts are extrapolated to larger spatial scales. by providing only one absolute risk category, which is often invasive or potentially invasive. Therefore, the tools do not consider the extent of the area, which is actually or potentially affected. And so we do not really know how big is the problem really. And last but not least, the tools often provide only a very rough indication what is generally advisable for the management of a non-native species. So there is a lack of really site-specific information what is needed to provide context-specific adapted management options. So based on these problems, we have defined the aims of the risk assessment framework for non-native tree species. First of all, with this framework, we want to assess the spatial and temporal invasion risks of non-native tree species, including the identification of endangered areas. We want to promote also to strengthen the evidence base for different sites. We would like the tool to be able to suggest management options which allow to mitigate detrimental impacts in demarcated areas and on the same time allow for utilization of promising non-native tree species in other locations. And with this tool, we would also like to identify regional or national data gaps which are needed to facilitate such a site-specific risk assessment, which we shorten with SSRA here in this presentation. So first of all, we designed the first draft of such a framework by identifying the components and the possible limitations and challenges of such a tool. And this first concept was then shared to be validated with other experts and stakeholders. And we conducted several workshops and we invited different groups of experts and stakeholders of forest conservation, silviculture, landscape planning, and nature conservation. And we incorporated the comments of which were provided during this experts workshops. And of course, we had also to define the keywords and some major principles we would like to follow with this framework. So that's it. Basically, this is the outcome of our project evaluation so far. So site-specific risk assessment, it is structured in 8 steps. For each step of the site-specific risk assessment, certain target information and data need to be collated. And we have somehow, we have divided this, this method in steps 1 to 4 that are mostly based on already existing knowledge. And while steps 5 to 7 generate new knowledge. And in the last step, we summarize the results. Just very shortly, I'm not able to go with you in very detailed now through all the single step, but I would like to give you some insights, what is new about this framework and what are the major objectives. So first of all, this risk assessment starts with a pre-risk assessment. So here you have to justify why you are performing this risk assessment. So you have to provide the reasons. And here you must include your non-native tree species. And you can select, for example, one or several specific non-native tree species which you would like to assess. And these might be either non-native tree species that already exist in the risk assessment area, or it might also include those non-native tree species which are not yet present in the area. For example, the selected tree species is already occurring in the neighboring region and the climatic environmental conditions match with the risk assessment area. It is important in a first step to define spatially explicit the area which is going to be assessed. Here are different spatial references possible. For example, this can be a country like Austria, or specific region in a country like Southwest Germany or Gorenska region, or it may even be a smaller scale, like for example, a national park. Steps 2, 3, and 4 are constipated as a desk survey. So here you really have to sit in front of the computer and search for the information that is already available. In a second step, you identify and you verify actually the presence of the selected non-native tree species by using, for example, monitoring data. In the third step, it is important to collate all the relevant and available knowledge on non-native tree species. So here you conduct a literature review, you collate the data, you get an overview on what is actually already known on the selected non-native tree species. And also it's important to gain an overview of all the available data sources which could be used for any analysis. And the fourth step, it's important also to collate all the information which is relevant for the habitat features in the risk assessment area, with a special concern to endangered habitats which could be potentially threatened by non-native tree species. In step 5 and 6, we move a bit away from the desk survey, and now we are in this part where we gain new evidence on the spatial extent of non-native tree species. We propose different methods, how it's possible to gain new knowledge. So for example, you can go into the field and collect new data. You can also analyze big data, large scale data like national forest inventory data or regional data. Or you could, depending on the objective that you have formulated in the pre-risk assessment, you can also do some models to simulate the potential distribution of a non-native tree species. Based on the collated information in step 5, you classify all this information by the level of evidence and relevance to the risk assessment area. Then you assess the likelihood, the magnitude, and the reversibility of the negative impacts for the different ecosystem types for which you have collected the data. And last, you should apply the decision tree. It's now not the time to go into details again through all this decision tree, but I would like to get your attention here to these 4 groups. So one of the major outcomes of this tool is to group the selected and assessed non-native tree species into 1 of 4 categories. So finally, you will end up whether the non-native tree species there's no data available. So even after you applied all the steps, you come up with the conclusion that the data is still not enough to assess the risks of this non-native tree species. So you have to highlight this is data deficient. You might come up also with that the non-native tree species is based on the current knowledge, seems to be currently safe species with a low risk of negative impacts. You might still recommend to keep monitoring this tree species. The third group are non-native tree species that pose the risks of negative impacts in some environmental contexts, but are currently safe to be used in other environments. And the fourth groups are non-native tree species that usually implies very high invasion risks. So there's a high risk of detrimental impacts, which are not reversible, and you cannot control them with specific management measures. In the step afterwards, in the 7th step, based on what we have, based on the knowledge we gained in the previous steps, we can develop a plan for management measures, for priority actions, prevention of spread, and further monitoring. And of course, we have to provide a conclusion of the site-specific risk assessment, which can be communicated. And in this conclusion, it's important to include your non-native tree-specific and your site-specific risk assessment evaluations. You have to explain, you have to provide a spatially explicit management plan and justify the limitations of the results. And therefore, you should provide a protocol of the methodology applied and all the references that you have used for your methods or for your assessments. And also important, you have to suggest a time frame when you think that such a risk assessment should be repeated for a specific non-native tree species. So what are the limitations? Of course, you may still deal with a lack of data even after you went through these steps. And so you're still not able to assess the risks of a non-native species. This is also, of course, connected to the available resources. So you need some financial support, for example, to go into the field or to hire someone who is conducting such analysis. Such an assessment is only valid for a certain time due to unpredicted changes under climate change, including pest outbreaks and disturbances. And whether the management recommendations that you provide in the end are really considered for official management plans is finally a political decision. And of course, not everyone can use such a tool. It can be applied only by trained staff, like, for example, forest research institutes or research institutes could apply such risk assessments. So this was more or less the very much theoretical part of this approach, but we are also testing this approach within our ALPTREES project, and we have some first trials made in Austria and Germany, and one ongoing test in Slovenia, which will be presented after this presentation. So with this, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.